And what exactly do you plan to do in there, Captain? Tap dance on the rudder pedals? I heard you had an unfortunate disagreement with gravity. Last I checked, flying a C5 Galaxy on a dead-stick approach requires two fully functional legs, not a pair of decorated crutches, and a bucket full of unwarranted confidence. The voice of Major Coulson, sharp and condescending, echoed through the cavernous simulator bay, each word a carefully aimed dart of public humiliation. The assembled crowd of younger, cockier pilots, all vying for a slot in the Advanced Transport Command, snickered in nervous compliance. They were sharks smelling blood, eager to align themselves with the perceived authority in the room. And today, that authority was a pompous major with a cruel streak. They laughed. But the target of his scorn, Captain Eva Rostova, offered no reaction. She didn't flinch, her gaze didn't waver, her jaw didn't tighten. Her silence was a stark, unnerving contrast to the loud arrogance filling the air. She simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the polished head of a simple wooden cane, her posture otherwise ramrod straight, her focus entirely on the glowing cockpit interface of the hulking simulator before her. Her flight suit, though perfectly tailored, seemed somehow unremarkable on her unassuming frame, a deliberate camouflage against the backdrop of preening egos. But when General Matheson, observing from the darkened upper control room, saw the way her fingers brushed over the pre-flight checklist on the datapad, a flicker of something ancient and profound stirred in his memory. He saw a rhythm, a practiced economy of motion that spoke not of training, but of instinct forged in crucibles he knew all too well. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The major saw a broken captain. The general saw a weapon in repose. The whole room had made an assumption, a fatal error in judgment they were about to have corrected in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. If you believe that true competence needs no introduction and that respect is earned in silence, not demanded with noise, type professional in the comments below. Coulson, basking in the glow of his own perceived wit, continued his tirade, his voice dripping with theatrical sarcasm as he circled Rostova like a predator toying with its prey. He was a man who had mistaken his rank for wisdom, his volume for authority. "You see, class," he announced, gesturing grandly towards the captain, "this is a lesson in limitations. The Air Force, in its infinite wisdom, believes in giving everyone chance. But here, in the real world, where physics is king, we must be brutally honest. Captain Rostova's record on paper is adequate." He paused for effect, letting the insult hang in the air. But a paper record can't compensate for a physical deficit. This simulation, the Typhoon Nightmare scenario, is designed to break our best pilots. A dual-engine flameout over the South China Sea, catastrophic electrical failure, zero visibility, and a crosswind gusting to 80 knots. It's a beast. I myself have only landed it, and I use that term loosely, twice in 10 attempts. So, with all due respect, Captain, his tone made it clear no respect was due. Perhaps you should let one of the able-bodied pilots take the first run. We wouldn't want you to strain yourself. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. The younger pilots shuffled their feet, their smirks fading slightly into expressions of pity. They saw a woman being politely, but firmly, put in her place. They saw a career quietly ending in a sterile, humming simulator bay on a Tuesday afternoon. What they didn't see was the subtle shift in Rostova's breathing, a transition into a state of profound calm that was more terrifying than any shout. She didn't look at Coulson. She didn't acknowledge his existence. Her entire universe had shrunk to the confines of the machine in front of her. With a grace that seemed impossible for someone leaning on a cane, she moved to the simulator door. Her hand rested on the latch. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet, devoid of emotion, and utterly final. "Open it." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The technician, startled, fumbled with the controls, and the heavy door hissed open. Rostova stepped inside, pulling herself into the pilot's seat with a fluid strength that defied her apparent injury. She didn't need the cane in the cockpit. The chair, the controls, the instruments, this was her true domain. As the door sealed shut, plunging her into the simulated darkness, Coulson scoffed, turning to the main observation screen. "All right, class. Let's watch how it's not done." The simulation began not with a gentle roar, but with a violent, cacophonous scream. The world inside the C-5 cockpit dissolved into a symphony of failure. Alarms blared in a discordant chorus. Red lights flashed across the instrument panel like panicked heartbeats, and the view through the windscreen was an impenetrable wall of swirling gray rain and strobing lightning. The heavy transport lurched, dropping 1,000 virtual feet in a gut-wrenching plunge that made several of the observers in the bay physically flinch. On the main screen, altitude and airspeed indicators spun wildly before flickering and dying. "Total electrical failure, cascade effect," Coulson narrated with a smug sense of validation. "Right on schedule. She's lost her primary flight displays, her navigation, everything. She's flying a dead-stick brick in a hurricane." This is where the panic sets in. This is where you lose it, but inside the cockpit, there was no panic. There was only a profound, almost reverent silence from its sole occupant. Captain Rostova's face, illuminated by the dying flicker of a single emergency floodlight, was a mask of serene concentration. Her eyes, calm and analytical, were not on the dead screens, but on the one instrument still functioning. A small, old-fashioned whiskey compass, its needle trembling erratically. Her hands moved with a preternatural calm, a ballet of quiet competence. She didn't fight the controls, she flowed with them. One hand feathered the yoke, making infinitesimal adjustments against the brutal crosswinds, not trying to conquer the storm, but to use its energy to feel its rhythm. The other hand moved across the overhead panel, fingers dancing over dead switches and breakers from memory, a physical manifestation of a checklist burned into her soul. She did not hope for a miracle. She did not pray for guidance. She did not curse her fate. She simply worked the problem. The narrator of this silent drama was the low groan of the airframe under stress, the hiss of wind over the canopy, and the steady, rhythmic pattern of her own breathing, a quiet metronome in the heart of chaos. On the outside, the younger pilots watched, their initial amusement curdling into a mixture of confusion and awe. They expected to see a wild, desperate struggle. They expected to see the frantic, jerky movements of a pilot overwhelmed. Instead, they saw control. They saw a terrifying, absolute mastery of a situation that was, by all accounts, unsurvivable. Coulson himself had fallen silent, his arms crossed tightly, a frown creasing his brow. This wasn't following the script. This wasn't the flailing of a novice. This was something else entirely, something he couldn't quite comprehend. The aircraft was still falling, yes, but it wasn't tumbling. It was descending in a controlled, if terrifyingly steep, glide. It was a leaf falling with purpose, guided by an unseen, unshakable will. The silence in the observation bay deepened, the only sound the faint hum of the servers and the simulated roar of the storm from the speakers. Every eye was locked on the main screen, where a small, abstract icon representing the C-5 was inching its way across a topographical map, a ghost ship navigating a digital sea. They were no longer watching a pilot. They were witnessing a phenomenon. The final moments of the approach were a masterclass in precision born from 1,000 hours of impossibility. The ground, a jagged smear of darkness and rain, finally broke through the lower cloud layer. The simulated runway lights were out, as per the scenario's cruel design. There was no glide slope indicator, no tower communication, no electronic aid of any kind. There was only the pilot's instinct and the raw, unmediated feedback of the machine. "She's too low. She's way too fast," Coulson whispered, the words escaping his lips involuntarily, a crack in his armor of arrogance. "She'll shear the gear off. It's over." He was right. According to every manual, every textbook, every standard procedure he had ever learned. A dead-stick landing in a transport of that size required a long, stable approach and a forgiving runway. Rostova had neither. She was coming in hot and steep, aiming for the very threshold of the tarmac as if she intended to drive the plane directly into it. But her hands, those steady, knowing hands, were telling a different story. Just as the aircraft screamed over the runway's edge, mere feet from the ground, she performed a maneuver so audacious, so contrary to all training, that it defied belief. With a final decisive pull on the yoke, she forced the massive plane into a high-alpha flare, a nose-up attitude so extreme it should have stalled the aircraft instantly. For a terrifying half-second, the C-5 hung in the air, its forward momentum converted into a breathtaking, momentary hover. The laws of aerodynamics screamed in protest. The pilots in the room gasped as one. It was a maneuver from the playbook of a fighter jet, not a lumbering cargo hauler. Then, with the grace of a falling feather, she let the nose drop. The plane settled onto the runway. There was no screech of tortured tires, no bone-jarring impact, no shower of virtual sparks. The landing gear kissed the asphalt with a whisper, a silent testament to a perfect calculation of energy, weight, and decay. The massive aircraft rolled forward, straight down the center line, consuming the length of the runway before coming to a gentle, unassisted stop precisely at the far end. The simulation ended. The roaring storm cut to absolute, deafening silence. On the main screen, a single line of green text appeared. Aircraft state, secure. Landing velocity, nominal. Structural integrity, 100%. The room was frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. The collective smirk of a few minutes prior had been wiped away, replaced by a uniform mask of slack-jawed disbelief. They had not just witnessed a successful landing. They had witnessed the impossible made manifest. They had watched a pilot commune with the very soul of her machine, bending the rules of physics through sheer, indomitable will. Major Coulson stood as if turned to stone, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. The words he had spoken just moments before, dripping with condescension and dismissiveness, now hung in the air like a foul odor, a monument to his own spectacular ignorance. He stared at the screen, at the perfect outcome of the impossible scenario, and a single, choked phrase escaped his lips, a quiet surrender to a reality he could not process. "That's not possible." The heavy door of the simulator hissed open, and Captain Rostova emerged, moving with the same deliberate, unhurried calm she had before. She leaned on her cane, her face impassive, her eyes giving nothing away. She had not performed for them. She had simply flown. Just as the first whispers began to ripple through the stunned silence of the observation bay, a new presence made itself known. The main doors at the far end of the hall slid open with a quiet, authoritative hiss, revealing not one, but three figures who instantly commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. They were generals, their uniforms crisp, their shoulders heavy with the stars that signified decades of command and sacrifice. In the center was General Matheson, his face a roadmap of hard-won wisdom, his eyes radiating an intensity that could quell insurrections or inspire legions. Flanking him were two other senior officers, their expressions equally stern and focused. The air in the room shifted, the atmosphere of a training exercise instantly evaporating, replaced by the grave seriousness of a high-level command intervention. The trio of generals didn't walk. They advanced, their polished boots echoing on the concrete floor, a sound that cut through the lingering shock. The pilots, including Major Coulson, snapped to rigid attention, their bodies reacting with instinctive military discipline. The generals ignored them. Their focus was singular, their path direct. They moved past the gawking trainees, past the humbled major, and stopped not in front of Captain Rostova, but the main instructor's console where Coulson had held court just minutes before. Matheson's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Technician," he said, his gaze fixed on the young airman at the controls, "bring up the personnel file for Captain Eva Rostova. Use my authorization. Override code. Matheson Omega 7 Delta, The technician's fingers trembled as he typed. The code was a ghost, a legend in the system, a master key that unlocked the deepest, most classified archives of the service. It was a code used for matters of the highest national security, not for reviewing the file of a captain in a training simulation. The room held its breath. On the main screen, the green text confirming the perfect landing was replaced by a secure military dossier. A photograph of a younger, unsmiling Rostova appeared, her eyes holding the same serene intensity. And then, the data began to scroll, and the myth began to unravel into fact. Every line item that appeared on the screen was a sledgehammer blow to the assumptions that had filled the room only moments ago. Coulson's face, already pale, turned ashen. He was not just witnessing a correction. He was witnessing the dismantling of his entire worldview, piece by humiliating piece. The younger pilots stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the unassuming woman with the cane with the litany of legendary accomplishments now scrolling before their eyes. The silence in the room was no longer one of shock, but of dawning, profound, and terrifying respect. General Matheson watched the screen, his expression unreadable, letting the weight of the information settle over the room like a physical presence. He was not just revealing a secret. He was teaching a lesson, using the raw, undeniable data of a hero's life as his textbook. The list of credentials that filled the massive screen was not merely a service record. It was the secret history of the nation's most desperate hours, written in the quiet ink of classified operations. Each line item landed with the force of a physical blow. Unit, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Airborne. The Night Stalkers. The legendary, almost mythical unit of elite aviators who fly the world's most advanced helicopters in darkness and secrecy, inserting and extracting special operations forces from the most hostile places on Earth. They were not pilots. They were ghosts who rode the wind. The room, filled with conventional transport pilots, fell into a deeper state of awe. This was like a parish priest discovering the quiet man in the back pew was the Pope. Call sign Ghost, a name whispered in reverence in the shadowy corners of the special operations community. A pilot famed for her preternatural ability to fly undetected, to land in impossible locations, and to bring her people home when all hope was lost. Specialty, catastrophic system failure, and dead stick recovery specialist. This wasn't just a line on a resume. It was a testament to a unique, almost supernatural skill. She was the one they sent for when the machine was utterly broken, the one who could coax flight from falling stone. The simulation that had been designed to be an impossible challenge for normal pilots was, for her, simply Tuesday. Then came the awards, a cascade of valor that silenced all doubt. Distinguished Flying Cross with V4 Valor. Bronze Star Medal, X2. Air Medal with V4 Valor, X4. And then, the final, most damning entry. Classified Mission Report. Redacted, Afghanistan. The files summarized the incident that had led to her injuries. Her MH-47 Chinook, heavily loaded with a Delta Force team, had taken a direct RPG hit to the tail rotor. Instead of bailing, instead of crashing into the mountainside, she had performed a controlled, auto-rotative crash landing onto a narrow ridge, a maneuver deemed impossible by the aircraft's own manufacturer. The impact had shattered both of her legs, but all 22 souls on board, crew and operators, had survived. She had saved them all. The file vanished from the screen as quickly as it had appeared. General Matheson turned away from the console, his movements slow and deliberate. He faced Captain Rostova, who had remained silent and still throughout the entire reveal. He did not smile. He did not offer a hand. He did something far more powerful. In the center of the room, in front of the humbled major and the awestruck pilots, the three-star general, a living legend in his own right, brought his heels together with a sharp click and rendered a slow, perfect, formal salute. His voice, now filled with a deep, resonant respect, rang out in the silent hall. Captain Rostova, he said, the words precise and clear. It is an honor to finally meet you in person, ma'am. The use of ma'am, a term of respect directed from senior general to a junior captain, was the final, devastating blow to the established order of the room. It was an acknowledgement that here, rank was irrelevant. There are two types of people in the military: those who follow the rules, and those who wrote them with their actions. Rostova, the quiet woman with the cane, was clearly one of the latter. She simply returned the salute with a crisp, economical motion. Sir, the story of what happened in Simulator Bay 7 did not just leak, it detonated. It spread through the base with the speed and intensity of a wildfire, a shockwave of humility that coursed through every barracks, every mess hall, every maintenance hangar. The initial narrative, a simple tale of a cocky major being put in his place, quickly evolved. It became the legend of the Ghost landing. Pilots gathered in hushed groups, pulling up the declassified elements of the 160th source public history, trying to connect the dots to build a mythology around the quiet captain they had so casually dismissed. The details grew with each telling. The impossible crosswind became a microburst. The dead stick landing became a triple engine failure. Her cane was no longer a sign of injury, but a totem, a symbol of a sacrifice that had purchased the lives of 24 operators. The event reordered the social hierarchy of the base overnight. Arrogance suddenly became distasteful. Loud boasts were met with quiet stares. The currency of respect was no longer flight hours logged in peacetime, but the quiet, demonstrated competence that Rostova had embodied. Major Carlson became a pariah, but not in the way he expected. He wasn't openly mocked. He was simply ignored, erased by a collective wave of contemptuous silence. He spent 2 days in self-imposed exile, replaying the simulation data over and over in his office. The green line of Rostova's perfect descent, a burning indictment of his own hubris. The clean, efficient curve of her flight path was a graphic representation of the gulf between his perceived expertise and her actual mastery. The experience had not just humbled him. It had broken him down and begun the painful process of rebuilding him into something better. He saw his reflection in the dark screen of the monitor and, for the first time, disliked the man looking back. He understood that his authority had been a hollow shell, and Captain Rostova, with her silence and her cane, had exposed it with a single, perfectly executed maneuver. The 3 generals, meanwhile, had quietly and efficiently closed the base. It wasn't a literal lockdown with gates and guards, but a lockdown of information. The event was classified. All personnel present were debriefed and signed non-disclosure agreements. The official record would state that a system diagnostic was being performed. This action only fueled the legend, transforming a training incident into a piece of institutional folklore, a secret shared by those who were there, a touchstone of a day when the established order was turned completely upside down by one woman's profound and unshakable competence. The base hadn't been closed to keep people out. It had been closed to keep the legend in, to let it marinate and mature into a lesson that would be taught for years to come. The apology, when it came, was as clumsy and awkward as Rostova's landing had been graceful and precise. Carlson found her not in the officers' club, basking in her newfound glory, but in a quiet corner of the base library, methodically field stripping and cleaning the intricate firing mechanism of a standard-issue sidearm. Her hands, the same hands that had tamed a hurricane in a metal box, moved with the patient, focused attention of a watchmaker. She was absorbed in the task, her entire world condensed to the small, interlocking pieces of steel in front of her. Carlson stood there for a full minute, wrestling with the words, his own voice feeling foreign and useless in his throat. The silence she projected was not hostile. It was simply complete, a state of being he found he could not penetrate with his usual bluster. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Captain," he began, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up, but a subtle pause in the movement of her hands acknowledged his presence. "Captain Rostova, I came to apologize. What I said in the simulator bay, it was inexcusable. I was arrogant. I was unprofessional. I was wrong." He stumbled over the words, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. Rostova slowly, deliberately, fitted the firing pin back into the slide, her movements unhurried. She slid the components together with a soft, satisfying click. Only then did she lift her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were not angry, not triumphant, not even forgiving. They were analytical, as if she were diagnosing a fault in a piece of machinery. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. The apology was accepted. The event was over. But then she did something unexpected. She gestured with a clean finger toward the weapon components laid out on the oilcloth. "You are looking at the wrong instruments, Major," she said, her voice low and even. "You looked at my cane. You looked at my rank. You looked at my gender. You made assumptions based on the fuselage." She paused, picking up the polished slide and holding it up to the light. "You want to know the quality of a weapon? You want to know the quality of a pilot? Don't look at the paint. Look at the hands. Look at the work. Everything else is just noise." It was the most she had said to him, and every word was a lesson. It was a philosophy, a creed, delivered in 24 words. Coulson stood there, the simple, profound wisdom of her statement washing over him. Look at the hands. It was a command to see past the superficial, to judge by the evidence of action, not the prejudice of appearance. That afternoon, the base commander, at the quiet suggestion of General Matheson, issued a directive. The Typhoon Nightmare scenario was officially renamed the Rostova Procedure. Simulator Base 7 was formally dedicated as the Ghost's Perch, with a simple, unadorned brass plaque installed by the door. It did not list her medals or her accomplishments. It bore only her call sign and the date of the landing. It didn't need to say more. Everyone already knew the story. Months later, the culture of the base had undergone a seismic shift. The Ghost's Perch had become something of shrine. New pilots, arriving full of the unearned confidence of youth, were taken there on their first day. They were not shown the plaque first. They were put into the simulator, and they were made to fly the Rostova Procedure. They all failed. They crashed into the digital sea. They stalled. They disintegrated on impact. They were humbled, their egos shattered against the unforgiving reality of that impossible storm. Only then were they shown the data from the original flight, the single, perfect green line of Captain Rostova's descent. And the instructor who guided them through this ritual of humility was a changed man, Major Coulson. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. The arrogance had been stripped from him, burned away by the memory of his own ignorance. He no longer taught pilots how to fly. He taught them how to learn. His lessons were filled with phrases he had once scorned, now delivered with the conviction of a true believer. "Forget what you think you know," he would tell the wide-eyed lieutenants. "Competence is quiet. Arrogance is loud. Look for the one who isn't talking. Watch their hands. That's where the truth is." He would tell the story of that day, not as a moment of personal shame, but as the most important lesson of his career. He spoke of Captain Rostova not as a rival, but as a standard, an ideal to strive for. The plaque on the wall was no longer just a name. It was a reminder that the true measure of a professional is not the absence of adversity, but the grace with which they master it. The legend of Eva Rostova had become institutionalized. It was a parable told to every new generation of aviators, a story about a quiet captain with a cane who reminded an entire base that respect is not a function of rank or appearance, but a direct result of undeniable, demonstrated excellence. Her legacy was not in the medals she had won or the mission she had flown, but in the change she had inspired in others. She had left behind a new definition of strength, one that had nothing to do with physical perfection and everything to do with an unbreakable spirit and a profound commitment to the craft. Her silence had become the loudest lesson the base had ever learned. True legacy is not a statue in a courtyard or a name etched in stone. It is not found in the grand narrative of history books, but in the quiet, incremental changes that ripple outward from a single moment of profound action. Captain Eva Rostova, call sign Ghost, never returned to that base. She moved on to other shadows, other impossible tasks, her path known only to a select few. She left behind no photographs, no recorded speeches, no personal mementos. All she left was a single, perfect data file of a simulated landing and a two-word philosophy that had been absorbed into the very DNA of the institution. Watch the hands, her story became a foundational myth, a teaching tool more powerful than any flight manual. It taught young pilots that the most formidable weapon in their arsenal was not the technology at their fingertips, but the unwavering calm in their own hearts. It taught commanders that the greatest asset under their command might not be the one with the most decorated uniform, but the one with the quietest voice. The triumph was not just hers. It belonged to the very idea she represented. It was a victory for every individual ever judged on superficialities, for every quiet professional who let their work speak for them, for every soul who understood that true strength requires no announcement. The world is full of noise, of loud boasts and empty promises, of people who demand respect they have not earned. But beyond that noise, in the quiet spaces, the real work is being done. It is done by the steady hands, the focused minds, the humble hearts. It is done by the ghosts, the silent professionals who hold the world together while no one is watching. They seek no credit. They desire no fame. Their reward is simply the perfection of the craft, the knowledge that the job was done right. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud prejudice and where silent professionalism defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.